Hello everyone and welcome to my newest video, which will be on the respective approaches to ontology, or we may even say metaphysics, uh, of three major thinkers from the 20th century philosophical scene, which are Donald Davidson, Willard Van Orman Quine, and Peter F. Strawson. So I will try to present all three of their approaches to ontology, and I will try to explicate what is peculiar, also in a sense what is common to all of those approaches. So I see one major thing they have in common is that they're all informed or reformed by the so-called linguistic turn that took place roughly around the beginning of the 20th century, where the emphasis or focus of philosophical inquiry turned to language, analyzing language as a mediate way of also doing philosophy, as the only properly critical way of doing philosophy, perhaps we could say. Also, I want to say that that kind of linguistic turn also has its cognates in the continental tradition. For example, we can mention people like Heidegger or Gadamer or Derrida, for instance. While I will not say that they are exactly analogous to what happened in the analytic tradition, they are broadly similar in some respects, with the shift of the focus mainly to language, or at least one of the central themes. Language became one of the central themes of philosophy in both traditions. But these three thinkers are roughly, we may say, from the analytic tradition. So I will be analyzing their views here. So, irrespective of the historical order of succession of these thinkers, they're broadly around the same time, but regardless of that, I will start with Donald Davidson. So, Donald Davidson has an ontological or metaphysical, as we may say, approach that is not classical or traditional like the other two philosophers talked about in this video, that will be talked about in this video. His project is more modest and careful than dogmatic or speculative metaphysics, in that all he is seeking to do is to explicate, analyze, and clarify the ontological assumptions hidden in our regular and ordinary ways of speaking, and not to discover the ultimate ontological structure of reality. The idea of a language is his equivalent or replacement of conceptual scheme, which he sees as not really separable from the content of thought, or the conceptual content or experience. For a conceptual scheme to be able to form and organize a given content, that content would previously need to be given in a purely sensory, neutral, and conceptually unstructured or unarticulated way or form. But that is impossible. So that is why he says that our differences in understanding and speaking stem from the differences in our language use, and not some radical or incommensurable difference in our conceptual schemes. If our conceptual schemes were optional, revisable, and radically different, we would not be able to understand each other at all. The principle of charity, which says that we must assume that people think roughly the same things as us, and that all of us are mostly right in our beliefs, precludes such radical parting of ways in our ways of thinking and talking. We understand each other precisely because we share a common framework, at least in most fundamental respects. So, radically different or incommensurable, as we may say, conceptual schemes would be a misnomer, would be unintelligible. And incommensurable pretty much means the two things that are different and not measurable by the same standard or criteria. We cannot find a neutral standard by which we will measure different conceptual schemes, and if such radically different conceptual schemes occurred, we will not be able to understand those other persons at all. But if we take language as the cognate or the equivalent of a conceptual scheme, then our respective differences may be may be able to be annulled by the respective translation of one language to another. And language does not necessarily mean natural language like, I don't know, French or Chinese or whatever, but I guess is in a more broader sense some kind of way of speaking, way of communicating, way of expressing oneself, may also differ within the same natural language, or may in a sense be common among different natural languages, I guess. So those wouldn't be equivalent with natural languages as field linguists understand them, for example. So that leads me to another aspect of Davidson's philosophy that is relevant to his ontology, that is his idea that there is only a causal connection between the world and our beliefs, meaning that the worldly happenings cause our beliefs and do not make them true or justify them in some epistemic sense. This has to do with his rejection of the theory of truth as correspondence, or the simple theory of truth as correspondence with external independent reality, which has its reason precisely in the unintelligibility of a conceptually unstructured objective reality or sensory given that I alluded to above. So we are justified in holding that most of our beliefs about the world are true precisely because those beliefs are caused by that very world. And we can know that at least indirectly through the successes of our communicative practices and mutual understanding. That is what justifies the bulk of our beliefs about the world, as well as most of our ontological beliefs, if we will still call them ontological. In summary, Davidson's approach to metaphysics or ontology is linguistic and logical in that he analyzes and thinks through our implicit ontological assumptions rather than trying to get at the pure theory of what there is by some special intuitive insight into the nature of reality. His view is not the traditional metaphysical one, in that he is more modest in his aims and more down to earth in his method, I would say, scrutinizing the empirical given of our language and trying to get at the underlying ontological presuppositions that are to be found in such language use. So I will now say a few things about Quine's approach to what we may call, actually what he calls in a sense, ontology. So Quine approaches the problem of metaphysics or ontology in a linguistically reformed way, as all of these thinkers do, and does not try to answer the question that is for him central to ontology, which is what is there, what exists, in some direct or speculative way. Doesn't try to answer that question in some direct or speculative way, but instead tries to explicate ontological commitments that are implicit in both our everyday language use and specialized technical, scientific, or philosophical uses of language. Ontological commitment is a subscription to a certain ontological theory or a theory of what entities or kinds of entities are in existence that is presupposed in our ordinary and scientific, in both our ordinary and scientific uses of language. For our statements involving possible reference, referent entities to be true, those kinds of entities would need to exist, and that is all that the logical commitment approach needs. The idea is not that whatever our statements or theories commit us to needs to be real, but only that our subscription or assent to those statements and theories has a background assumption belief in the existence of those entities. So those theories need not be necessarily explicit or conscious, but maybe also implicit or tacit in some sense. So persons need not be aware of what they're committed to, but the language still, in a way, commits them to the existence of those things. Quine is not a complete relativist or skeptic about ontological matters, even though he tacitly gives up the project of traditional speculative metaphysics. He still thinks, despite that we can have fairly good ideas about what actually exists or what entities and kinds of entities populate the world. For one, through common sense, that he doesn't think of as totally legitimate, but primarily through our best scientific theories. Our best current science is our best and most reliable guide to what there is, and that it will be the kinds of entities that science is ontologically committed, in a way just explicated, or which its theories presuppose, implicitly or explicitly. One thing to note here is that although Quine's approach is in a sense scientific, Ontology as a discipline dealing with the class of existent things, as Peter van Inwagen says, is not to deal with just any old classes of things, but relatively general and ideally the most general classes of things that are. So when we are making ontological theory, in the technical philosophical sense, we cannot just enlist the kinds of existence that are relatively particular and specific, like mice and cars and notebooks. Although those too would be kinds of ontologies, albeit not exhaustive and systematic ones. Ontology should ideally aim at the highest genera in the hierarchy of abstraction, and additionally it should reduce those genera, or what we may call categories, ontological categories, to the smallest possible but still permissible number. The idea is that we should not, for the sake of theoretical simplicity and scope, list more categories that are necessary to encompass everything we believe exists, and additional categories are allowable only if what falls under them is not reducible to the other fundamental kinds of existence. So we could have substances, attributes, events, actions, or more, only if those additional categories cannot be understood in terms of those more basic and fundamental category, of some more basic or fundamental category. Otherwise, we would have subcategories and not more basic categories. One thing that can be addressed to Quine as an objection of the pessimistic meta-induction kind, which states that what past scientific theories have postulated has largely been shown to be wrong, so there is reason to think that what the scientific theories of our day postulate is also likely to turn out wrong, or at least has a good chance of turning out wrong. Quine seems overly optimistic about the prospects of scientific theorizing, as he seems to think that what the current scientific theories believe in has more chances of being true than, say, some theories of the past, or sometimes in the past. But we could perhaps soften the blow of this attack on Quine by saying that our present scientific theories are our best guide to what is not necessarily a perfect or infallible guide. Quine need not either postulate that the best science of the day is incorrigible, nor that other forms of inquiry have no right to a hearing or a stake in the matter, but only that out of the available alternatives, our best bet is to side with ontology that our best science proposes as the true one. So now we'll pass on to talk about Peter Strawson's approach to ontology, as we may say. Peter Strawson, for his part, opted for what he called the descriptive metaphysics, which in contrast with the revisionary approach to metaphysics, tries not to criticize but only to explicate the ontological assumptions and categories already contained in our everyday ways of thinking and talking. Those very assumptions are seen as reliable guides to what the world is like, or at least how we fundamentally conceive of it, suggesting perhaps that those ways of viewing the world are not optional, nor even up to our deliberate choice. This has a close proximity to common sense metaphysics, assuming that ordinary language is a guide to what we find commonsensical or immediately intuitive. Strauss's project of descriptive metaphysics, it is safe to say, has Kantian overtones, and we wouldn't make a mistake, we wouldn't err if we supposed it to be broadly Kantian in spirit. For one, he rejects speculation as a legitimate method of metaphysics. Second thing is that he also seeks the implicit structures that make our experience possible as it is. But he distances himself from Kant on some important points, and those would be the rejection of transcendental idealism and the thing in itself, or the noumenal realm, and also the scope of his project is not a priori and transcendental in a sense that Kant's is, where he is not trying to get at the a priori conditions of all possible experience, but tries to describe the basic structures of our actual experience and ordinary talk. So he sees no need of seeking the necessary conditions of any experience as such, of all experience as such, and he is happy with simply conceptually analyzing what is already present in common thought and talk. Now, ontology, as understood in an absolute and dogmatic sense, would aim for the exposition of the objective categories of being as they are, independently of any mind or language. But supposing anything even exists apart from minds and language or words in general, such a thing would naturally be very difficult or rather impossible to come by. What Gustav Bergman says in his article on Strawson's Ontology, what he calls in that article our epistemological predicament, is that we can never abstract ourselves from our subjective epistemic positions and perspectives to observe the world as it objectively is, in some absolute sense of objective. We are bound to our finite and partial points of view, but that may not in itself imply that our attempts at understanding and describing the world are doomed from the start. We may still have considerable access to the world and considerable epistemic right to judge about its contents, without believing ourselves to be endowed with God's eye point of view or a neutral standpoint from nowhere, completely objective standpoint. Strawson, though, goes further than that, at least if we are to trust what Bergman says, in restricting the ontological project even further than epistemologically needed to the communicative domain. So the ultimate measure stick of, or the yardstick of a legitimate ontology, is not just knowability but communicability. Where I see Strawson is referring to the pragmatics of language and actual interactional successes, which are an even more restrictive constraint than inner isolated knowing. So we may even recognize some pragmatist leanings in Strawson's philosophy here. So remember, the sophist Gorgias placed telling others after knowing in the as the last link in the chain of the ontological, the epistemological, and the linguistic aspects of his nihilistic and agnostic position, at least as professed in some texts that remain as a testimony to his statements. So when he says nothing exists, even if it did exist, I wouldn't be able to know about it, and even if I were to know about it, I wouldn't be able to tell anyone about it. I wouldn't be able to communicate my knowledge or my ideas. So, in a sense, communication comes even after knowing, and maybe even a more strict condition on the legitimacy or validity of some ontological or philosophical view. So that is it for this video. Thank you for listening, and I hope it has been enjoyable, informative, interesting, and consider subscribing, liking, commenting, sharing. And also, if you would like, you can also support me monetarily through my PayPal account, which I'll post a link to in the description. So thank you for now, and bye bye.